Well, good morning. Beautiful day outside, and I can actually say that without having to explain the rain was necessary, and so was the cold. It's great to be in the house of the Lord today. We're going to hit a milestone today. We're in chapter 13, the book of Nehemiah. I know, take a collective sigh here. Thanks. Book of Nehemiah, chapter 13. Downside is we'll be looking at all of chapter 13. I'm kidding. No, seriously, the downside is we'll be looking at all of chapter 13. And while you're turning to chapter 13 of the book of Nehemiah gleefully, I will take another drink of water. I don't know what I'm going to do when I stop coughing into the microphone. I'll have to come up with something else to get your attention. Maybe that might work. I don't know. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 1. On that day, they read aloud from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and there was found written in the law that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet the sons of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned it from a curse into a blessing. So it came about that when they heard the law, they excluded all the foreigners from Israel. Now prior to this, Eliashib, the priest, was appointed over the chambers of the house of God, being related to Tobiah. He prepared a large room for him, where formerly they had put the grain offerings, the frankincense, the utensils, the tithes, the grain, the wine, the oil prescribed for the Levites and the singers and the gatekeepers, and contributions for the priests. During all this time, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 36th year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had gone to the king after some time. However, I asked leave from the king, and I came to Jerusalem and learned all about the evil of Eliashib had done for Tobiah, and by preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. And it was very displeasing to me, so I threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room, and I gave an order that they could be cleansed. And I returned the utensils of the house of God, the grain offerings, and frankincense. I also discovered that portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and singers and performers of the service had gone away, each to his own field. So I reprimanded the officials and asked, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" Then I gathered them together and restored them to their posts. And all Judah brought the tithe and grain and the wine and the oil into the storehouse. And in charge of the storehouse I appointed Shemaiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, Peliah of the Levites, in addition to Hani and Zucker, the son of Zucker, and the son of Mattaiah. I'm getting really good at reading these names now after 13 chapters. For they were considered reliable, and it was their task to distribute to their kinsmen. Remember me, O God, this day, and not blot out my loyal deeds, which I have performed for the house of my God and its services. In those days I saw in Judah some who were treading wine in presses on the Sabbath, and bringing sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, as well as wine, grape, figs, and all kinds of loads. And they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I admonished them and told them that the day they sold. Told them on that day they sold. Also, men of Tyre were living there, who imported fish and all kinds of merchandise, and sold them to the sons of Judah on the Sabbath, even in Jerusalem. Then I reprimanded the nobles and said to them, "What is this evil you are doing by profaning the Sabbath? Did not our fathers do the same, so that our God brought on us and on this city all this trouble? Are you not adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath?" And it came about that just as it grew dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded the doors to be shut, and they should not open until after the Sabbath. And I stationed my servants at the gate, that no load should enter the Sabbath day. And twice traders and merchants of every kind of merchants spent night outside Jerusalem. Then I warned them and said to them, "Why do you spend the night in front of the wall? If you do so again, I will use force against you." And from that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves as gatekeepers and sanctify the Sabbath day. For this also remember me, O God, and have compassion on me, according to the greatness of thy loving kindness. In those days I saw that the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and for their children half spoke the language of Ashdod, and none of them was able to speak the language of Judah, but the language of his own people. So I contended with them and cursed them and struck some of them and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons. Did not Solomon the king sin in regarding these things? Yet among many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by God, and God made him king over Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women caused even him to sin. Do we then hear about you having committed this great evil by acting unfaithfully against God by marrying foreign women? Even the son of Joad, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Hornite, and I drove him away. Remember them, O God, because they defiled the priesthood, and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Thus I purified them from every foreign and appointed duties for the priests, the Levites, for each task. And I arranged the supply of wood at appointed times and the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. Whew, that's a lot. There are things I've watched on TV that, you ever have this happen? You understand it at a certain level, and then when you go through an event that the guy is discussing, you understand it at a greater, deeper level. Bill Cosby has a skit that says children have brain damage. And I thought it was funny before I had kids. And now that I'm a dad, I know why my mom has gray hair. Because I'm the source of all of it. Cosby goes into a skit. The kid is there covered in flour. His brother's covered in flour. And you look at the child and you said, what happened? And the kid looks up and goes, I don't know. Did a bag of flour combust on your head and cover you in all this? Huh? And as a dad, I've sat and had conversations like this. And you look and you go, because they're looking at you, and they're oh so sweet when they look at you. I have girls, and they're oh so sweet, and being that they got their good looks from their mom, that it helps them out immensely. And so you look at it, and you go, just stop. I'm convinced that my guardian angel suffers from PTSD. And when I was a kid.
Please don't send me out. I can't take it anymore. Can I call in sick?
Now, why do I say this? Because here in this passage, Nehemiah, going back to chapter 10, they swear an oath that they won't do any of this. And he comes back to Jerusalem, and he's got to be, you people have got brain damage. Did we not just swear an oath to this? Uh-huh. I think sometimes God looks down from heaven at us and he just goes, I made them. I'm not going to kill them all. And you look at this passage. Notice how it begins. It starts off really good. When I was a chaplain, I used to have soldiers come to me and go, Chaplain, you got a minute? I go, yeah. He goes, well, let me close the door. And that's not a good sign to begin with. And then they go, well, there I was at the club. And I go, stop. We are at the high water mark of this conversation, aren't we? Yes, sir. I said, okay, just so I know. And then it just spirals out of control from there. Notice what happens here. In chapter 13, verse 1, it says, in the day that they read aloud the book of Moses, this is a good thing. Here, in the hearing of the people, they found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter into the assembly. Well, it's a good thing. So they banned all the foreigners. After this part, it just goes down from there. Now, why is this important? If you go and look in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 1 through 5, I'll read this for you. 1 through 5. No one who is emasculated or has his male organ cut off shall enter the assembly of the Lord. No one of an illegitimate son shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of his descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall enter the assembly of God. No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. And none of the descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall enter the assembly of the Lord. Because they did not meet you with food and water on the way when they came up out of Egypt, but instead they hired Balaam. Now, we haven't really discussed this. Nehemiah is a eunuch. So verse 1 of 23 applies to Nehemiah. So here is a man who cannot enter into the assembly of the house of God, watching people who can defile it. A man who would love to be able to enter into the holy places to worship God, who is excluded due to the fact that he was made a eunuch by a foreign pagan king, and watch people that have access to this great thing hold it in such great disdain. Imagine this sense. We've just dealt with this. You all took an oath for this. And yet, no sooner do I leave, the nobles start throwing up the game. It's kind of like when the cat's away, the mouse will play, right? When the boss isn't there, how much work is going to get done? And so Nehemiah comes home to Jerusalem that should be steadily trucking on with reform, and yet has reverted. Let's take a look at this. Let's go to verse 4. Now Eliashib, the priest. Now this is some debate of whether or not this Eliashib is the same Eliashib later on in the chapter. I think it is. Who is the high priest. Eliashib, the priest, was appointed over the chamber of the house of God, being related to Tobiah. Remember Tobiah? Arch enemy Tobiah? Mr. Hey, if a fox jumps on the wall, it's going to collapse Tobiah. The guy that's trying to get the children of Israel to quit building the wall, Tobiah. That guy, a pagan. He prepared a large room for him, where formerly they put the grain offerings, the frankincense, the utensils, the grain, the wine, the oil, the Levites. So basically what Eliashib did was take a room set aside for consecrated things of God and said, it's not important. My friend Tobiah needs a place to stay when he's in Jerusalem. And apparently the temple's the Motel 6 for that area. And moves him in. The nobles and the priests began to side again with the folks that are their enemies. Here's the thing about reform, folks, or revival, however you want to look at it. It's not simply enough to have a reform or a revival and then stop. See, that's what happens. We usually, let's just use marriage. Couples go to marriage seminars. I used to teach them, and couples come home, they are on fire to start taking care of one another. And then after a couple of weeks, you're like, if it lasts that long, I kind of like things the way they were. Because I was happier then. Right? I don't have to get up and make her breakfast. I don't have to get up. The first couple weeks, it's really neat and cute. But then after a while, it's like, this is kind of drudgery. The same with reform and revival. It starts off and everybody catches fire and it's great stuff. And then, it's so much easier to go back to the way it was. If you look, on Wednesday night we've been studying church history. Luther, after being excommunicated from the Catholic Church, begins a new denomination called Lutheranism. And from Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and the Anabaptists have come just about every other Protestant denomination in existence. And here's the thing, folks. That great Reformation movement that swept across Europe, that fought a 100-year war between Catholics and Protestants, that's given us great missionary moments, guess what? Not a single one of those denominations doesn't have a liberal strain in them, to include Baptists. Matter of fact, Luther's great movement, you now have a group of Lutherans that want to go back to the Catholic Church. See, reform that stops is destined to fail. It's not simply enough to reform one time and go, well, I took care of that. It's like taking the trash out once when your wife asked you to and say, hey, I took the trash out. Remember, you ever had this conversation, you never help around the house? What? I took the trash out. 3 years ago, you took the trash out. But I took the trash out. Right? It doesn't kind of carry water at that point, does it? See, taking it out once doesn't mean that it is something that you can put in your merit bag forever. Reform that stops is half-hearted and half-measured. And see, that's what happened. They had some revival, they had some reform, but it stopped. See, lest we think that the book of Nehemiah is about building a wall. Unless we think that the book of Nehemiah is about building a wall to secure people. It's about bringing a people of God who were in a flat-out rebellion against their own God back into alignment in that relationship with God and bringing revival to those folks. And in this process, the reform took ground for a little bit, and then as the leader was gone, they began to swing back around. Here's the thing about a reformation and about a revival. It simply cannot be tied to one man. If it's tied to one individual, it eventually fails. It has to be something the people grab hold of, internalize, and move forward in order for it to continue to grow. All movements based upon one man eventually fail, with the exception of one, because we're indwelled by the third person of the triune God. Correct? And so for that to continue on, Nehemiah had appointed people in charge, but they failed at their task. Notice this. The Levites allowed for this to happen. A priest, possibly the high priest, put Tobiah in. Tobiah did not come into the city and say, I want that room. The people internal did that. So Nehemiah tossed his stuff out into the street in order that the rooms be cleansed. Let's look down at verse 10. I also discovered that the Levites had not been given to... I also discovered that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who perform had gone away to their own field. And I reprimanded the officials, saying, why is the house of God forsaken? You're going to see this repeat itself throughout this passage. I happened to notice this happened. And then I reprimanded the nobles, or I reprimanded the officials. Why are these folks doing this? Remember, it was in chapter 5 that the nobles had to be brought into subjection because they were charging usury. It was also later on that we found out that the nobles, the reason why most of the nobles were favorable to Tobiah is because they were somehow twistedly related to him. This is a really bad Shakespearean play at points, where you look at it and go, anyhow. So after the high water mark, you have an enemy being moved into the temple. You now see that the stuff that is supposed to go to the Levites for their management is not, and so they have to go back to their own fields. So worship at the house stops. See, the purpose of worshiping at the house of God is that the people of God come together and worship God as one voice. Properly, rightly. Alistair Begg wrote that when people begin wrong in their worship of God, they will end wrong in their lives. To begin wrongly in the process of worshiping God is in itself to set yourself on a self-destructive course. And that's what they've done. Well, it's not that important. I got to have this for this. Nehemiah sets these things into action, comes back, and sees that it's not done. That's what he said. So then I appointed Shimei, Zedek, the scribes, Pedadiah, and of the Levites, in addition to them, Hanai, the son of Zucker, and the son of Mattaiah, considered reliable. And it was their task to distribute to their kinsmen. So Nehemiah comes back and he sees that that part has not been done. And then he comes back and he says, in those days, verse 15, I saw in Judah someone treading in the wine presses on the Sabbath, bringing sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, as well as wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of merchandise. And they brought them to Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I admonished them on the day they sold it. See, this is a huge no-no. The text tells us 6 days you work, 1 day you rest. It's the example set by God. It was a command for the Jews to follow. And this command they take an oath, a binding obligation. And Nehemiah's got to be looking at them and going, you people got brain damage. Did you not just take an oath? Yeah, and we had great revival. And then after you left, it kind of sputtered out. It had great revival only because Nehemiah was there. But it really did not alter or change the hearts of the folks because it was tied to a man who was going to enforce it because he had the power to do it. It's not in something that they had internalized. Why? Because here's the thing, folks. The people didn't look at the nobles and said, hey, what you are doing is wrong. Folks, we have great revival in our country today. The problem is, we look at our political system and go, wow, we need to fix that. You know what the problem is with our political system? Folks, we're 54% of the voting bloc of America. We voted those folks in, whether by a lack of voting, or voting for them, or voting for based upon what would impact our pocketbook over morality, or being apathetic. We put those folks in. See, our actions determine how these reforms take place. You hear politicians talk about reforming everything under the sun, and nothing happens. You know why? Reform's a great word, but it's only a word without action. And people have to put it into action. Whether you have reform in your home at your home, in your personal life, that is something you have to act upon. Whether you have reform in your family, where you take headship of your home fathers or wives as you submit to the role of the husband, and you teach children how to live a godly life. Whether you take reform into your business world, all these things require action. You simply just can't come in at home and say, I plan to reform the house, and then sit down. Right? That's like saying, I have a great plan for everyone, and walking away. It doesn't work that way. Reform requires action and requires constant action. Because here's the thing. When we became a Christian, that was a revival of a dead thing into a living thing. And then we have an option. Stop right there, or actively be involved of putting to death the deeds of the flesh in every aspect. And the moment we stop that pursuit, we are losing ground. When the children of Israel stopped following these reforms, they began to lose ground. Notice they regressed back to where they were before Nehemiah had them take this oath. In our personal walk, when we stop pursuing the things that hinder our race, as we talked about today in the book of Hebrews, we begin to lose ground. We become that ship that we talk about in the book of Hebrews that drifts because its moorings are cut. The Christian life is not something where you go, I had revival. Now I'm just going to go over here. It's a constant pursuit. The children of Israel are learning that this is a constant pursuit. You simply cannot just go, well, Nehemiah made us take a covenant, therefore that's what takes care of it. Notice what happens. They are pressing wine on the Sabbath. This is a huge no-no in the Old Testament. People die for these things. They went into slavery for these things. Then they're buying fish from the men of Tyre over these things. See, the revival didn't take. And the men didn't put it into action because they were only words. Then I reprimanded the nobles and said to them, what is this evil thing you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Remember, false concept of worship leads badly in the end. Did not your fathers do the same thing so that our God brought this on us? And on this city, all this trouble, all the exile, all the destruction, everything that has happened since 586 or 605, depending on which date you want to go with the first exile. Well, 586 is the last when the temple's destroyed. Let's go 586. From 586 to 445. That's a long period of time. where they stopped being able to rule themselves, have the temple, be able to worship God, and be their own autonomous state. They were slaves. They are owned by a foreign king who can do with them as he wills because they rebelled against God. And when Nehemiah puts them on the road to recovery and the road to restoration, they immediately go back to that road. See, revival without action is only an emotive movement. I used to work youth camps. I used to be an RA. I got the jacket, all the patches on the back. I was like a super stud in RAs, man. Whew. Regional staffer, state staffer, staffer of the staffer. I could teach you how to come off a rappelling tower while shooting a .22 into a canoe. Whew. That was awesome. We used to do skits every night of the week, and man, we would get those kids wrapped up and start off with a skit, and we'd always close with this one because this one got them down the aisle. Did it for 4 years. Every year saw the same kids. Every year saw the same kids. There's tears rolling down their cheeks, saying the same prayer. Then they went home. The things of the world impacted what they believed that they had a revival in. The next year I saw them. See, folks, here's the thing. It was emotive. We rigged the system to where it would be emotive. We manipulated those kids down an aisle because we really worked on them hard on that. And there are pastors that do that and have people come down the aisle and tears streaming down their face, but those folks are dead inside. Because it didn't take. Because there was no real conversion. There was no real conversion. These people did not assent to the idea that God is holy, because if they did, they would not have gone back to what they did. See, revival based only in emotion is going to die out. It requires action, it requires commitment. And this is the message that we should pull away from Nehemiah. Revival that is only purely stationed in emotive is going to end up, you go from 10 to here, it's the same issues. They even swore an oath and took on curses. And you saw how much that did. We have a nation that is hurting desperately for spiritual awakening. It is a secular nation. We are no longer a Christian nation. We're not even a Christianized nation. And every year, when it becomes election time, we vote in the folks that help steer the nation's course into this depravity. Folks, we're the ones that put them in office because we are the majority voting bloc. And we are the least to show up at the poll. Not to say that revival begins through a political action. It never really works well when it does. But revival begins when the people of God begin to embrace the things of God and begin to hold and live by them in such a way that it brings real change, not in a political system or in a nation, but in a home, in a personal life, in a life that is sold out and committed to Christ, and then within the home that it is taught and managed, and then within the business affairs, and then within the community, and from the community within the state, and then from there. That's how a revival begins, because if it begins, if we try to do it at the state upper level, it is going to fail. It begins first in our homes. Actually, it begins first within our hearts. And then it begins in our homes. And then it begins here, 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 and here. And that's the message we should pull away from Nehemiah. These folks have had one of the greatest gifts given to them, a long-suffering God who could have just said, I've had it. I've had it with you people. I wipe you from the face of the earth. And I pick a new group of brain-damaged people and tolerate them for a while. But he didn't. In spite of the fact that we are enemies, sinners, hostile, open combatants with God, he sends his Son to die in our place so that we can have a restored relationship with God and then exacerbate him some more with the way we live. Right? And And look at him and go, oh, well, look at Adam. First sin. Adam, where are you? Over here behind the trees. So you can't see me because you're omniscient. What happened? Well, God, funny thing happened on the way home from the market. The woman that you gave me, she gave to me an 8. I thought it was a pear. He didn't blame the woman, he's blaming God. And imagine being God there as he's telling you this story, as the created looks at the Creator and goes, you know, it's your fault because you gave me this woman. Just go away. Daddy needs a break. Just go away. Go far away. The reform doesn't take because the action doesn't meet it. Let's continue on. Notice that in verse 19, just as it comes dark, he commands the gates to be shut, and this time he stationed his servants, members of his personal guard, to block and seal the gate. And then he orders the Levites to become consecrated to be gate guards. You want to cut down on illegitimate and illicit activities in a town? You put a bunch of preachers outside a place that's a house of ill repute, and you'll have people go, oh, I'm sorry, I thought this was 7-Eleven. Verse 23. For in those days I saw Jews married to women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and their children half spoke the language of Ashdod, and none of them were able to speak the language of Judah. Ashdod is one of the 5 cities of the Philistine Empire. You have married people from your arch enemy. And now your children know nothing about God to the point that they don't even speak the language of your people. See, one of the problems about when we have marriages that are married to folks that are not believers, you have this tension. I have never seen date evangelism work. When I worked with youth years ago, I'm dating him to get him into heaven. No, sweetheart, he's dating you to drag you into hell. I've never seen date evangelism work. People go, oh, it works for me. Okay, there may be some anecdotal evidence out there like that, but I have never seen it work in my years of experience. And what usually happens is the slide towards depravity begins in that way. Because what happens is that person has a negative pull because it reaches into that side of us that is bent towards that. And so the children are taught that the things of God aren't important, to include the language of the children of Jews, who then begin to speak the language of the Ammonites, Moabites, and the Philistines. And there's no worship of a holy God. And that is why they can desecrate the temple by putting a pagan in a room and not fulfill their altar and not take care of the temple, and the priest must go into their field to earn a living. See how one of these builds upon another. See, the reform didn't take. A revival or reform without action of the individual doesn't go anywhere. It's strictly on an emotive basis. Did not Solomon the king sin regarding these things? Yet among nations, there was no king like him, and he was loved by his God, and God made him king over Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused him to sin. Do we then hear about you having committed this great evil, acting unfaithfully against God and marrying foreign women? Now here's the great crime here. It's bad enough that Solomon did it, as an example. Even one of the sons of Joab, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Hornite. And I drove him away. The line of the high priest had to be a purebred Jew. Otherwise, you could have someone take and ascend to that position that is not, who is not observing the things of Israel. You have the son of the high priest marrying the daughter-in-law of one of your other, becoming the son-in-law of your other arch rival, thus negating his ability to serve as high priest. And this bunch probably would have voted him in just because he was popular. All because they wanted to do what they wanted to do, in spite of following and honoring God's law. See, that's the thing about revival. It requires us to commit to things that we used to do that we thought were fun, and have us move towards a holy God. And the pull to embrace the things that we used to enjoy doing that were detrimental to our lives and offended a holy God is so great that we can never stop in our battle against it. There's no rest break. Hebrews calls it a race, a marathon. I'm not a big runner. I had a friend at the advanced course. He said, I ran 25 miles this morning. I said, is your car broke? Call me next time. I'll give you a ride. He says, no, I run it for fun. Right then and there, I had to look at him and say, I'm sorry. You called it fun. Yeah, it's fun. That's like military intelligence. It's oxymoronic in its nature. So I drove him out, and he needed to. Why? This guy can't be a high priest, should not be a high priest. Remember them, O God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. And I purified them from everything foreign, and appointed duties for the priests and for the Levites and their task. And I arranged to supply wood at the appointed times. Remember, that was a sore issue back in chapter 10. Remember me, O God, for the good I do. This is a phrase that is repeated 3 times. Nehemiah is wanting to ensure that God sees the work of Nehemiah in spite of the wickedness that goes on. Remember, here is a man who is not allowed to enter into the holy place of God because of his service to a foreign king. And you'll have a high priest's son hold that thing that is supposed to be special and desecrate it. The man would love to go into the temple and cannot. Holding the children of Israel to such a high standard of reform that he looks at them and goes, you people got brain damage. See, folks, revival comes in America when it first comes into our homes, when it first comes into our lives. Sometimes that comes in the initial aspect when we have a non-believer who accepts Jesus Christ as Savior, and simply, here's the thing about the bad model about our current evangelism system. We believe that Matthew 28 tells us to do evangelism. It doesn't. It tells us to make disciples. So we go out and we save people. And then we go, now that you're saved, I'm going to drop you here with a Bible, and we walk away. And that person either withers and dies or finds his way through a Bible somehow. Revival begins when we begin making disciples in our own home. When we begin making it there and teaching it to our children and instructing them in the things that honor a holy God. And then it moves when we begin to take that beyond ourselves and our families into our everyday life. And we have a culture and a society today that says, sit down, shut up, we don't want to hear. And we ought to respond to that by saying, absolutely not. I have just as much right to my opinion and to state it publicly as you do to not listen. So pound sand. Amen. And then it moves much further when we go without the public market and square, and then into our actual political activity when we go and pull that curtain close and ask ourselves, should I vote for this guy that's promising me everything to include a chicken in every pot, or this guy here that's saying he's a moral individual and his life has demonstrated it? And then it occurs when we hold those individuals accountable. and ensure that they do what they are supposed to do. See, revival does not start here, well, I'll vote and put in the person I like. Nah. It occurs when we have a right relationship with God and carry that right relationship into our community. Otherwise, it's just emotive. Otherwise, it peters out. Otherwise, it just dies. And that's the warning that we should see from the book of Nehemiah. It's not about restoring a wall. It's not about restoring a people. It's about bringing a sense of revival and reform to people that had forgotten the holy God. And they serve as a reminder and a warning to the church today, because, folks, in America, the church has lost its voice. And we are silent on moral issues when we should be yelling, not nasty, not mean, but yelling that this is immoral and offends a holy God. And we are silent. And yet we look for reform, we look for revival, and it will not come unless the people of God are driving the train. This is the warning that Nehemiah gives us. This is the goal that all believers should be pushing towards. This is the purpose of why the church is here, to bring light into a hurting and dying world and hope to people dying and going to hell. Let's pray. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the warning that Nehemiah brings us, that we serve in a world that has moments of sheer darkness and then moments of bright light. We ask, Heavenly Father, that you would help us take the unchangeable message of God to those who know not who this Savior is. We ask, Heavenly Father, that you would be within us a force that drives us to be a light in darkness. We ask for all these things in your name, we pray. Folks, if you will stand as the praise band begins to sing. If you're here today and this is your first time, or you've been here for a while and you're looking for a church home, and you say, you know, I think I found a place here. I ask that during the time as they sing, you come down the aisle. I'll have my mic turned off. It'll be a conversation between me, you, and God. If you're here and say, you know, I realize that I have offended a holy God in my actions, and I want to make that right. Again, I'll be here at the front. My mic will be turned off. It'll be a conversation between me, you, and the Lord. As we wait now, as the band sings.
Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this day. We thank you for the words and acts that you have spoken. Pray, Lord, we thank you for the heart. We thank you for this today. Just be with them. Be with our loved ones. Be with our soldiers overseas, civilians. We just thank you again for this service. Lord, be with us as we go our separate ways. Be with us. Bring us back again tonight. All these things asked in your name. We say, amen.